December 19th, 1944, the Ardennes. Snow drifted like ash over the shattered pines of Belgium. The forest was quiet, but not peaceful. German infantry crouched behind the ridgeline, eyes fixed on the valley below, a valley that was supposed to be theirs by nightfall. Through the mist, they saw it. A line of American tanks, silhouettes moving through the white haze. The first was hit, a clean strike from a Panzerfaust. Flames burst from the turret. The men cheered. Then the cheering stopped. The tank didn't stop. It kept moving. Fire spilling from its hull, its gun still pointed forward as it rolled through the smoke. A second one followed, half its tracks blown apart, yet it dragged itself onward like a wounded animal refusing to die. German soldiers froze, staring in disbelief. Some whispered that no one could still be alive inside. Others turned and ran, because for a brief, unforgettable moment, it looked as if the American tanks no longer needed men to fight their battles. In the winter of 1944, the war in Europe had entered its final, most brutal chapter. The Allies had landed in Normandy 6 months earlier, shattering Hitler's Atlantic Wall and pushing the Wehrmacht back through France. Yet the German army, though battered, was not broken. In the dense forests of the Ardennes, Hitler's generals were preparing one final counterstrike. A desperate gamble meant to split the Allied lines and force a peace on German terms. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. Against this backdrop of snow, steel, and exhaustion, one weapon came to symbolize the unrelenting momentum of the Allied advance: the American tank. From the fields of Normandy to the frozen roads of Belgium, the sight and sound of Sherman's rolling forward became both a promise to the Allies and a nightmare to German troops. The M4 Sherman, America's primary medium tank, had begun the war as a simple design. Reliable, mass-produced, and easy to repair. It wasn't the strongest tank on the battlefield. The German Panther and Tiger outgunned it easily. But the Sherman had something the others didn't: numbers, adaptability, and mobility. For every Tiger destroyed, 5 Shermans would appear in its place. And when one Sherman went down, another crew could often have it repaired within hours. To the Germans who faced them, it began to feel as though the machines themselves refused to die. In Normandy, tank crews had already seen Shermans continue to move after being hit. Sometimes the driver was killed instantly, but his foot stayed pressed on the accelerator. Sometimes the clutch locked, and the machine kept rolling forward, turret aflame, like a ghost still charging into battle. German infantry who watched these burning hulks advancing through the hedgerows called them Die Geisterpanzer, the ghost tanks. But this illusion of unstoppable machines wasn't just mechanical accident. It was also psychological warfare born of industrial supremacy. American factories, from Detroit to Chicago, produced more tanks, parts, and engines than all of Germany's war industries combined. Entire divisions could replace their losses in days. Tank crews trained in methods of battlefield recovery that allowed even damaged vehicles to be towed, patched, and sent back to the line. German soldiers, by contrast, often saw their heavy Tigers and Panthers abandoned for lack of fuel or spare parts. The psychological contrast was devastating. For a Wehrmacht soldier on the front, every tank silhouette emerging through smoke or snow could feel like an omen. They knew that behind it stood a production machine they couldn't match, a country that seemed able to pour out steel faster than they could destroy it. By 1944, American armored divisions had also adopted a new doctrine: keep moving. If a tank was hit, the others didn't stop. They advanced, maintained formation, and overwhelmed the enemy through motion and coordination. This tactic, born from the hard lessons of North Africa and Italy, created a terrifying illusion during combat. Even when some tanks were disabled, the rest kept charging. To those on the receiving end, it looked as though nothing could stop them. Not shells, not flames, not fear. And there was more. As Allied engineers experimented with remote-controlled demolition vehicles and gyro-stabilized guns, rumors spread through the German ranks that the Americans were using automatic tanks, machines that could drive themselves, aim themselves, and hunt targets even after the crew was gone. These stories weren't true in any practical sense, but they revealed something deeper. A growing sense among German troops that technology itself had turned against them. By the end of 1944, the tank had become more than a weapon. It had become a symbol of industrial power, of human determination, and of the unstoppable tide closing in on Germany from the west. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, that symbol would soon come alive. In fire, in smoke, and in the terrified eyes of those who believed they had just seen the first glimpse of a new kind of warfare. The illusion of crewless tanks was born not from imagination, but from the chaos of war itself. In the tangled forests of the Ardennes, visibility was often no more than 20 meters. The snow muffled sound, the smoke distorted light, and explosions came without warning. To a soldier fighting on the ground, the difference between a living tank and a dead one was often impossible to see. During the Battle of the Bulge, this confusion became almost supernatural. American armored units, particularly from the 3rd and 4th Armored Divisions, operated under a doctrine of continuous motion. Even under heavy artillery, tank commanders were ordered not to halt. If one vehicle was hit, the next would take its place. If a tank caught fire, others would use it as cover. The battlefield became a rolling storm of fire and steel. In such conditions, damaged tanks often continued moving after their crews were incapacitated. A struck Sherman might lurch forward in gear, its engine still running, smoke pouring from the engine deck. Sometimes, its turret turned slowly as heat warped the metal or hydraulic pressure leaked. To German soldiers watching from foxholes, it looked alive. Mechanical will replacing human control. Reports from German field units reflected this unease. In one after-action log from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, a company commander described an engagement near Bastogne. "We destroyed 2 of the American tanks with Panzerfausts, but they continued forward, burning. The men hesitated to approach them. We believed the machines were driven without men." In another report filed by the 2nd Panzer Division, infantrymen spoke of tanks that advanced despite multiple hits and turned their guns though no man could be seen in the turret. To experienced officers, it was clear these were mechanical flukes, a jammed throttle, a gear locked forward. But to the soldiers in the mud, exhausted and frozen, such sights fed a deeper fear that the Americans possessed technology beyond understanding. And indeed, the Americans did have innovations that seemed almost impossible by wartime standards. By late 1944, U.S. engineers had perfected the gyro stabilizer, a device allowing tank gunners to aim and fire while on the move. A feature German tanks largely lacked. They had developed advanced radio coordination that linked tank platoons, artillery, and air support into one fluid force, and experiments were already underway with radio-controlled target tanks and remote demolition vehicles, early precursors of modern drones. While these systems were rarely used in active combat, intelligence leaks and captured equipment convinced some German officers that America was indeed testing unmanned armor. The psychological result was powerful. Even a rumor could change behavior. Soldiers hesitated to engage tanks up close. Commanders misjudged the number of active units, and entire platoons withdrew from positions based on the belief that the enemy possessed self-propelled war machines. This misunderstanding spread fast, partly because of the fog of war, and partly because it fit the growing sense of dread that defined the last months of the Reich. By winter, most German divisions were fighting with little fuel, dwindling ammunition, and no air support. The once invincible panzers that had stormed through France in 1940 now struggled to move a few miles without breaking down. In contrast, American logistics seemed endless. Convoys of tanks, fuel trucks, and repair crews stretching as far as the eye could see. Each tank, even when burning or crippled, represented more than a machine. It represented a system, an empire of industry, oil, and manpower that Germany could no longer challenge. And so, when the snow-covered hills of Belgium came alive with the low roar of approaching engines, German soldiers felt not just fear of death, but a kind of fatal awe. The battlefield seemed haunted, not by ghosts, but by a mechanical inevitability that no bullet or shell could stop. Soon, this fear would crystallize into stories. Whispered accounts of American tanks that moved on their own, of ghost crews, and of machines that kept fighting long after men had fallen inside them. Those stories, born in the frozen woods of the Ardennes, would become part of the strange psychological warfare that shaped the closing months of World War II. And within them lay the seed of something larger. A new kind of terror in modern warfare. The fear that machines, once created by man, might outlive their masters. For the men on the ground, fear didn't arrive in speeches or orders. It came in flashes of metal and sound, the clatter of treads echoing through the trees, the deep mechanical growl that made the earth itself vibrate. German infantrymen, many of them teenagers drafted from the Volkssturm, had been told that American tanks were crude and weak compared to their own panzers. But what they saw in the Ardennes defied every lesson they'd been taught. When a tank burns, it doesn't die quickly. Flames curl through the open hatches, ammunition cooks off, and pressure explosions send shards of steel whistling into the snow. Yet even in those moments, many Shermans kept rolling, the last commands of dead drivers frozen into motion. To a soldier staring down the barrel of one, that movement looked unnatural, even alive. German diaries recovered after the war described the same recurring image. A burning tank lumbering forward, unmanned, gun pointing skyward, its crew already gone. One corporal from the 212th Volksgrenadier Division wrote, "The tank burned like a furnace. We thought it was finished, but it came straight through the smoke. My friend fired his rifle at it, though we both knew it would do nothing. It did not stop until it hit a tree. That tree, charred and splintered, stood for weeks afterward. Villagers later said it looked like the forest itself had been punched by a ghost." The terror wasn't just about dying, it was about not understanding. When men saw the impossible, a tank without a crew still advancing, the rules of war collapsed. Their courage, built on logic and discipline, faltered under something that felt supernatural. And once a soldier lost the belief that his enemy could be understood, he began to lose the will to fight. Angle 2. The technological edge. Machines built for momentum. What the Germans didn't know was that much of this terrifying illusion came from American design itself. The M4 Sherman was built not only for reliability, but for persistence, the ability to keep moving even under catastrophic damage. Its Continental R975 engine, adapted from aircraft design, was notoriously rugged. If punctured by shrapnel, it could still run on partial cylinders. The transmission system was mechanical, not hydraulic, meaning even if the driver lost control or was killed, the gears could remain engaged. A tank could crawl forward under its own momentum for several seconds, sometimes hundreds of meters, before finally stopping. And because American tank doctrine emphasized constant forward pressure, these mechanical ghost movements became common sights. Commanders like General Patton believed that motion was life, that a stopped tank was a dead tank. His orders were simple: keep moving, no matter what. In practice, that philosophy meant even destroyed vehicles served a purpose. They blocked roads, absorbed enemy fire, or, in some cases, sowed psychological confusion. To the Germans, already familiar with the precision engineering of their own machines, the Sherman's brute persistence seemed illogical. The Tiger might be an apex predator in a duel, but the Sherman was a swarm, cheaper, faster, easier to maintain. A single Tiger might destroy 3 or 4 Shermans in an engagement, but the 5th one would finish the job. German engineers respected the American design privately. After the war, one captured officer admitted, "The Sherman was not elegant. It was not beautiful, but it never stopped coming. We built perfect machines. The Americans built endless ones." Angle 3. The Battlefield Psychology. Fear as a Weapon. By 1944, fear itself had become an operational tool. Allied command understood that morale, not just ammunition, could decide a battle. The relentless advance of armor, even burning, even crippled, reinforced an idea that America could not be stopped. This doctrine wasn't accidental. Reports from the U.S. Army's Psychological Warfare Branch noted that consistent visible movement of armor had a demoralizing effect on enemy infantry. Even the sight of disabled tanks continuing to move could create panic and retreat. Every soldier knew that machines didn't feel fear, but the human mind isn't built for rationality under fire. When a burning tank pressed forward through the snow, it became a symbol of inevitability, the embodiment of defeat. In several recorded engagements near Houffalize and Mannheim, German machine gunners abandoned their positions at the mere sound of tank engines behind the smoke, believing they were surrounded. In reality, many of those engines belonged to damaged Shermans still idling or rolling downhill after hits. American commanders noticed this psychological shift quickly. In one division report from late December, a colonel noted, "Enemy infantry broke at the first sign of armor. Even disabled tanks caused withdrawal. Recommend continued use of burned-out hulls to conceal advancing elements." This line, buried in an operations log, revealed an unspoken truth of late-war combat. Tanks had evolved beyond weapons. They were now symbols of inevitability, of industry, momentum, and human ingenuity, overpowering exhaustion and despair. By winter's end, the myth of the crewless tanks had spread from foxhole to headquarters. The Germans didn't know it yet, but what they feared most wasn't the tank itself. It was the machine's reflection of something larger, a nation whose will to move forward had become mechanical. Behind every steel monster moving through the European countryside was a doctrine, forged not in laboratories, but in the mind of generals who understood that movement itself could be a weapon. No one embodied that belief more fiercely than General George S. Patton. Patton's philosophy was brutally simple. A tank that moves, lives. A tank that stops, dies. His armored divisions were trained to press forward under any circumstance. Even when isolated, even when outnumbered, even when under fire. The strategy was rooted in shock and momentum. Never allow the enemy time to recover, and never let fear dictate pace. Patton's subordinates absorbed this mentality deeply. During the Ardennes campaign, American tank commanders often pushed through minefields or artillery barrages just to maintain the rhythm of attack. If one tank was lost, the rest accelerated. The result was a constant rolling wave, a visual and psychological avalanche that felt, to those facing it, unstoppable. Meanwhile, on the German side, morale was collapsing. The once proud armored divisions that had thundered across Europe now found themselves crippled by shortages: fuel, ammunition, spare parts, even food. A Tiger tank might need 500 liters of fuel to travel 100 kilometers. Many couldn't move at all. Crews cannibalized other tanks for components, and some resorted to horse-drawn transport for supplies. Against such desperation, Patton's doctrine became more than tactics. It was theater. Each advancing Sherman column carried a message, "We will not stop. Even when one of us falls, the line moves forward." German officers who survived the Ardennes later described the crushing effect of this momentum. One battalion commander recalled, "Their tanks came through the trees as if they did not fear death. Even when we hit them, they burned but continued to move. My men said the Americans had no souls left, only machines." That perception of the enemy as machine rather than man marked the turning point of psychological warfare. Once that belief took hold, the Wehrmacht's fighting spirit began to fracture from within. Angle 5. Enemy Reports. The birth of the ghost tank. Myth, the legend of the driverless tanks, didn't emerge from propaganda offices. It began in field reports, scrawled in pencil by exhausted soldiers. Throughout late 1944 and early 1945, Wehrmacht intelligence summaries from the Western Front began to note unusual behavior among Allied armor. Reports spoke of burning tanks that continued to advance, vehicles with no visible crews, and tanks whose guns turned though no operator was seen. In one chilling entry, a German lieutenant near Elsenborn Ridge described, "We thought the tank was finished. Fire inside, hatches open, yet it rolled onward in silence. I saw no head, no hand, nothing human. My men fled before it reached our line." Historians later verified that the event likely involved a Sherman with a jammed throttle sliding downhill after its crew had bailed. But to the men who witnessed it under artillery fire, there was no logic, only terror. These accounts multiplied. Some units believed the Americans were experimenting with radio-controlled tanks. Others whispered that the Allies had mechanical soldiers, early robots, capable of fighting without life. The reality was far simpler, but no less powerful. Fatigue, shock, and the distortions of battle had blurred the line between machine and myth. By January 1945, even German intelligence officers began including ghost tank sightings in situation briefings, unsure whether they were mechanical accidents or deliberate Allied deception tactics. The myth had become institutional. For the Allied forces, that worked to their advantage. Fear spreads faster than fire, and the rumor of self-moving tanks reinforced an aura of technological dominance. What began as mechanical fluke became a weapon of legend. Unintentional, yet devastating. Angle 6. Tactical confusion. When smoke made machines seem alive. War rarely offers clarity, and in the closing months of the conflict, confusion ruled every battlefield. Thick smoke from artillery shells, burning oil, and frozen mist could turn even the most disciplined unit into chaos. When a Sherman or Pershing rolled through smoke, its silhouette appeared distorted, towering, shifting, and spectral. Through snow and fog, the flash of a muzzle or the spin of a turret seemed detached from the rest of the machine. December 22, 1944. The fog was thicker now, swallowing the Ardennes whole. German troops in the 2nd Panzer Division pushed toward Bastogne, expecting to crush the remaining pockets of American resistance. But what they encountered on the road near Marvy would defy every assumption of the war. An entire column of Sherman tanks appeared ahead. 30 tons of steel rolling in slow, steady unison. From the tree line, Obergefreiter Hans Eckhart raised his field glasses. The first tank moved awkwardly, its left track dragging, its hull blackened from previous shelling. He signaled his men to fire. The Panzerfaust hissed, striking the Sherman dead center. Fire erupted through the top hatch. And yet, impossibly, the tank continued forward. No turret rotation, no visible crew, just a burning hulk crawling toward them, engine roaring through the smoke. The men panicked. A few shouted, "Geisterpanzer!" Ghost tanks. Others hesitated, fearing a trap. Then the second Sherman emerged behind it, unscathed. turret swiveling methodically toward the ridge. A flash. A shell exploded 20 meters from Eckhart's position, showering the snow with dirt and fragments. The German line broke into chaos. What they didn't know was that the American armor wasn't possessed. It was programmed by circumstance. When the crews were killed or wounded, the tank's throttles often jammed open, transmissions locked into gear, or internal fires triggered secondary movement. From a distance, it looked deliberate, an unstoppable mechanical advance. The Germans had spent months studying Allied armor, but they had never seen anything like this. In the early stages of the Battle of the Bulge, U.S. supply convoys and armor groups were scattered. Many tanks, abandoned or crewless, kept moving downhill after being hit, propelled by gravity or jammed engines. The result was psychological warfare by accident. Columns of flaming Shermans creeping forward through fog and snow, their machine guns still glowing from heat, their empty hulls giving the illusion of willpower. By the evening of December 22nd, reports began circulating among German officers. American tanks that refused to die. Some claimed they saw crewless machines driving straight into panzer positions, detonating as if guided by unseen hands. One report from Kampfgruppe Piper described self-moving vehicles advancing through fire. The Germans, already exhausted and low on morale, interpreted these moments as proof of new Allied technology, perhaps remote control or mechanical automation. But the reality was more human and more haunting. Many of those tanks contained the bodies of crews who had fought until their final breath. The machines that continued to move were not symbols of technology. They were tombs rolling on momentum, carrying their dead captains and gunners toward the enemy lines. In Bastogne, surrounded American units picked up radio chatter of German fear spreading through the ranks. Some U.S. tankers even started leaving burned-out wrecks positioned to roll downhill at night, using the terrain to send unmanned vehicles straight into German formations. A few were packed with spare ammunition, crude but effective traps. These improvised ghost tanks were no invention of science fiction. They were acts of desperation, ingenuity, and vengeance combined. For the Germans, the illusion deepened when infrared scopes, a new technology introduced in limited Panther tanks, captured moving heat signatures long after the crew had perished inside. Flames, engines, and cooking metal appeared on the screens as life. The operators couldn't distinguish between machine heat and human presence, and the result was terror disguised as science. On the frozen roads of the Ardennes, the psychological tide began to shift. German officers who once mocked American inferior tanks now faced the sight of those same machines defying logic. A panzer commander near Houffalize wrote in his diary, "They do not stop even when dead." Perhaps that is the strength of their army. The will continues after the man is gone. By the time Christmas Eve arrived, the battlefield looked less like a traditional front and more like a graveyard of moving steel. Burning Shermans crawled forward until they collapsed into ditches or trees. Their silhouettes, flickering in the fog, turned into myths whispered across the German lines. Soldiers who once stood firm against flesh and blood now faced the uncanny. A mechanical ghost, born not from invention, but from tragedy and endurance. And in that frozen chaos, one realization spread quietly through the German ranks. The Americans were not just fighting with machines. They had built a war that could move even after death. By the dawn of December 24, 1944, the German offensive had begun to lose its rhythm. The once confident columns of panzers that had stormed through the Ardennes now crawled through bottlenecked forest roads, blocked by wreckage, abandoned vehicles, and burning American tanks that seemed to defy reason. In the valley east of Bastogne, Kampfgruppe, Piper's units encountered what survivors later called the Night of Moving Fire. Through the fog, flames drifted like ghosts. Sherman tanks, already hit by artillery, kept sliding down icy slopes, their turrets facing nowhere, their hulls glowing red. Some were pushed by secondary explosions, others simply rolled downhill by gravity. But to the soldiers watching through the smoke and snow, it looked like the Americans had unleashed a fleet of driverless machines. One German sergeant recorded in his field log, "They kept coming, even when empty. It felt like fighting the dead." At the same moment, the U.S. 4th Armored Division was breaking through from the south. General Patton's forces, driving hard to relieve Bastogne. Patton, aware of the psychological damage his advancing armor was causing, ordered his men to push through the night, through the fire, through everything. American radio intercepts confirmed that German units were confused and unnerved by reports of autonomous tanks. Patton turned that fear into a weapon. His supply units began towing damaged Shermans into enemy sightlines, setting them alight, then releasing them downhill. Unmanned, but still mobile. The sight of glowing, crewless tanks rolling toward entrenched German positions at midnight was devastating. German infantry often fired prematurely, revealing their positions to American artillery. A few officers later testified that their men refused to engage tanks at close range after seeing haunted steel move through the fog. On December 25th, near Assenois, one of the most surreal scenes of the battle unfolded. A burning Sherman from the 37th Tank Battalion, its interior destroyed and crew presumed dead, rolled out of the forest straight toward a German 80mm gun crew. The Germans hesitated, uncertain whether it was still manned. By the time they fired, it was too late. The shell struck, detonating the tank's remaining ammunition in a blast that wiped out both the Sherman and the gun crew. When American infantry advanced minutes later, they found no living soul on either side. Only melted tracks and twisted metal, locked together. The rumor of crewless American tanks spread faster than radio messages could contain it. By the end of December, entire German platoons were reporting phantom movements in the fog. Men claimed they heard the distant rumble of engines at night, even when no tanks were nearby. Psychologists would later call it battlefield echo stress, an auditory hallucination born from exhaustion and fear. But in the freezing forests of Ardennes, it felt real enough to paralyze hardened veterans. Meanwhile, inside Bastogne, the defenders, surrounded, starving, and half-frozen, heard the stories too. To them, these ghost tanks were not symbols of terror, but of resilience. Each burned-out Sherman that kept moving became a message. The line still held. The machines still fought. Even as human strength failed, steel carried the fight onward. The climax of this strange legend came on December 26th, when Patton's 4th Armored Division finally reached Bastogne, breaking the German encirclement. Eyewitnesses recalled the surreal sight of dozens of destroyed American tanks lining the approach roads, many of them resting at odd angles, as if they had simply stopped mid-charge. The Germans had tried to clear them, but some had moved unpredictably during the fighting, making safe passage impossible. To the Germans, these machines symbolized futility, the relentless industrial spirit of an enemy that never seemed to tire. To the Americans, they represented sacrifice, the will to keep moving, even when life itself had left the vehicle. When news of the Ardennes battles reached Allied command, reports of driverless tanks were dismissed as exaggerated accounts. But the myth endured. In post-war interviews, German veterans often described these moments as among the most unsettling of the war, not because of the destruction, but because it stripped them of rational control. Machines that should have died with their crews instead advanced like mechanical phantoms, indifferent to bullets or fear. The Ardennes would become a graveyard of both men and machines, but also a symbol of something deeper: the turning of the tide. For in those ghostly, self-moving tanks lay the essence of the American war machine, an unstoppable momentum that carried through chaos, through death, and through disbelief itself. And as the fog lifted over the smoldering
When the
forest,
Battle of the Bulge
the
finally
German troops
subsided
realized
in late
something
January
profound.
1945,
Their blitzkrieg,
the Ardennes
once
was no
the terror
longer
of
a
Europe,
forest.
had finally
It was a
met a force
graveyard of
more
twisted
enduring
steel
than
and
fear.
frozen men.
Snow covered the wrecks of hundreds of tanks, German and American alike, their outlines softened by weeks of frost. Beneath that quiet white blanket lay the story of a psychological war that had scarred both sides beyond repair. For the Germans, the offensive that had begun as Hitler's last great gamble ended in chaos. What was meant to split the Allied front and reclaim Antwerp had dissolved into confusion, exhaustion, and fuel starvation. The Crewless tanks, though never a formal Allied tactic beyond a few deliberate uses, became an unintentional psychological weapon. German morale had already been brittle. Facing mechanical specters in the fog only deepened their despair. Captured Wehrmacht diaries revealed raw fear. One entry from a lieutenant near Bastogne read, "We could not fight something that did not stop. Even when burning, the enemy's armor advanced. We felt small, hunted by ghosts of iron." Another, from a sergeant in the 2nd Panzer Division, described how entire squads abandoned positions after hearing what they believed to be engines moving through the mist without men. American commanders, reading these notes weeks later, understood the unplanned psychological advantage they had gained. General Patton himself, reviewing battlefield reports, allegedly muttered, "If it scares them, it serves us." Even the dead tanks fight for the living. The Allies suffered tremendous losses, over 80,000 casualties in the Ardennes campaign. But the German toll was worse, nearly 100,000 killed, wounded or captured, and over 600 tanks lost. The myth of unstoppable American armor, whether powered by human hands or sheer industrial might, became a defining element of post-war German testimony. Mechanically, the reason for those moving corpses of tanks was simple, but tragic. When a Sherman or a Pershing was hit, inertia sometimes carried it forward, especially on slopes or icy terrain. Burning fuel or detonating ammunition could also jolt the transmission into gear. Some tanks even kept rolling because their engines hadn't been fully disabled. The crew killed instantly while the vehicle's systems kept running for seconds, sometimes minutes. But logic could not erase the horror of witnessing such things firsthand. Soldiers are trained to fight men, not machines that move after their masters are dead. In the winter silence that followed, Allied recovery teams worked among the wrecks. Many of the tanks still smoldered weeks later, their interiors frozen black. In one haunting account, a recovery unit near Hufelise found a Sherman half buried in snow, its engine faintly humming despite the absence of a crew. The mechanics shut it down quietly, leaving a helmet on its hull. A simple act of respect. The psychological ripples of those events reached far beyond the battlefield. In the post-war years, Allied studies into mechanical persistence, the tendency for machinery to continue functioning after catastrophic damage, led to deeper research in battlefield automation and damage resistance. Engineers began designing systems that could survive partial destruction, allowing vehicles to complete minimal maneuvers autonomously. The ghost tanks of the Ardennes indirectly inspired real technological evolution. In Germany, however, veterans spoke of those nights with unease. To them, it was as if America had found a way to give its machines a will of their own. Interviews conducted in the 1950s by British historians recorded this sentiment repeatedly, not as superstition, but as a symbol of how industrial warfare had surpassed human comprehension. Meanwhile, in American memorials, the burned-out tanks became silent monuments. In Bastogne, villagers left wreaths on their hulks every winter, remembering the crews who never left their steel coffins. Children who grew up near those relics were told that these tanks had fought on even after their men were gone. What had been terror to one side became heroism to the other. The Battle of the Bulge reshaped more than strategies. It reshaped belief. It showed the world that the war had entered a new kind of age, where machines carried the fight even when men fell, where the rhythm of engines and the will of nations blurred into something terrifyingly unstoppable. And as winter gave way to spring, and Allied forces began pushing toward the Rhine, the Germans who had survived the Ardennes carried one final haunting memory: the sight of American tanks, burning and empty, yet still advancing through the fog, as if the war itself refused to die before they did. When the snows finally melted across the Ardennes in March 1945, the wreckage emerged like scars reopening under the thaw. The forests, once silent and ghostly, now echoed with the clang of recovery crews, the metallic grind of cranes lifting corpses of tanks from ditches. For weeks, American engineers cataloged every vehicle, every destroyed Sherman, every burnt-out half-track. Each piece of metal told a fragment of the same story: the cost of stubbornness, of machines that refused to quit. In Bastogne, where the fighting had raged most fiercely, entire fields were littered with tank carcasses. Local farmers described the ground as iron soil. American soldiers walking through the ruins found melted helmets fused to turret walls, dog tags welded to gun mounts, and shells still lodged in the barrels of cannons that would never fire again. The war had stripped away all illusion of glory, but in its place, it left a brutal kind of respect for both the men and the machines that had stood against the impossible. Across the ocean, newspapers in America hailed the Ardennes victory as proof of Allied invincibility. Few readers realized how close the Germans had come to breaking the line. But what captured the imagination were the strange reports trickling in from the front. Tales of haunted tanks, ghost armor, machines that fought alone. Editors dramatized these accounts, turning battlefield confusion into legend. Hollywood would later echo it in war films where tanks rolled through explosions as though driven by courage itself. Yet behind the myth was cold engineering. The American industrial machine had reached its apex, producing tanks faster than the enemy could destroy them. Even when crews fell, replacements and reinforcements filled the line within hours. To the German soldier in the field, it looked supernatural. To the American war planner, it was simply logistics in motion. Still, technology alone didn't explain the human reaction. Survivors on both sides described how the phenomenon of moving, burning tanks left a deep psychological mark. A U.S. medic recalled tending to a German prisoner who whispered, "We shot them, we saw them die, but the tanks kept coming." To that man, it wasn't strategy. It was something spiritual, almost apocalyptic. The phenomenon also sparked quiet debates among Allied commanders. Some officers, including General Eisenhower's staff, later reflected that this mechanical persistence symbolized the nature of total war. That even when the human spirit breaks, the machine keeps going, powered by momentum and inertia. It became a haunting metaphor for the entire conflict. Humanity creating forces it could barely control. In the months that followed, the U.S. Army salvaged thousands of tons of wreckage. Some tanks were melted down for scrap, others were repaired and redeployed, but a few, particularly those near Bastogne and Humanitarian, were left deliberately in place. They became silent guardians, reminders of the December nights when steel seemed alive. Today, those hulks still stand, blackened and rusted, surrounded by plaques describing their units and crews. Tourists walk by without knowing that in 1944, those same tanks were whispered about as haunted. In the German archives, meanwhile, psychological evaluations of returning soldiers showed measurable, trauma linked to mechanical persistence. Troops who fought in the Ardennes displayed heightened anxiety toward armored sounds, even the rumble of peacetime vehicles. Historians later used these findings to study the emotional toll of industrial warfare, where the enemy was not only human but mechanical, relentless, and seemingly immortal. The Battle of the Bulge marked the end of the Old World, the age of human-scale war. What rose from its ashes was the modern age of mechanized willpower, where nations waged battles through endurance and production, and where the line between life and machine blurred under falling snow. Today, the rusted tanks in the Ardennes stand silent under pine and rain. Moss creeps along their armor. Their tracks are frozen in time, yet the ground beneath them remembers. The echo of engines that kept turning after the men inside were gone. History calls them machines, but for a moment in that terrible winter, they were something more. They were the last heartbeat of a dying war, still moving even after life itself had stopped.